Okay, I think we'll begin this session of MSD at Home with Thomas Danielll, Notes from a Small Island. But to do that, I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. So I begin proceedings by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I am presenting, the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to their ancestors, past, present, and those emerging, and to all Indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders witnessing this presentation. It's really a pleasure to be able to host this presentation today with Thomas Danielll, mainly because I enjoy having conversations with Thomas about architecture in general, and particularly about his deep knowledge of Japanese architecture. But also in preparing for this, it did make me finally read fully and comprehensively his recent publication from 2018, An Anatomy of Influence, really dealing with sort of contemporary history of Japanese architects, or at least the architects who have constructed the recent history of Japanese architecture. Thomas is a professor, tenured professor, at Kyoto University in the architecture department. In fact, the first foreign tenured professor in the architecture department at Kyoto University. He comes originally from New Zealand, from Wellington, where he attended Victoria University, but he's been resident pretty much full-time, not exactly, since 1992 in Japan. So he has a very extensive network and contacts and understanding, as much as one could as a foreigner living in Japan, of the sort of history and trajectory of contemporary, let's say from mid-century of the 20th century forward in terms of Japanese architecture. So I'm going to turn it over to Thomas. I just would recommend the book very highly. I had difficulty because mine's stuck in my office at the University of Melbourne. So I was able to get a copy to be able to read it in preparation for this. And I have to say, it's really a fantastic book. It's really an amazing kind of resource to work through. So, order it online. And then, in this COVID-19 lockdown situation, it's a perfect book to study and dig into in depth, because there's really a lot there to deal with. So I'm going to turn it over to Thomas. Thank you very much, Thomas, for being with us. Thank you for making the time and being able to present your work. And I'll let you take it away, and then we'll come back, have a bit of a conversation, and then open it up to larger questions from the audience. So it's over to you, Thomas.
Thank you, Don. It's really great to be here. I'm very grateful to you and to the Melbourne School of Design for the invitation. I want to talk about some recent tendencies in contemporary Japanese architecture, but I'll first begin by introducing my recent book, An Anatomy of Influence. Let me just share the screen. So the book was published about 1.5 years ago, and it comprises 12 biographical portraits of post-war Japanese architects based on conversations with the subjects, but choosing 12 architects from a long list of candidates was difficult, to say the least. And I selected individuals who occupy positions within the field that are as far away from each other as possible, so they form a kind of zodiac of disciplinary projects. And I wanted to discover the motivations behind their work by asking about their childhoods and their educational experiences, and their employment histories, and their personal and professional relationships. And the architects were generally very forthcoming. I gave them enough room and wrote to tell their sides of the story, though some of them were shocked when they saw the raw transcripts of our conversations, and they asked for the more defamatory or inflammatory anecdotes to be removed. And in some cases, I used the conversations as the basis for essays, which allowed me to add some historical context and critical perspective, but in most cases, they remain as conversation transcripts, albeit amended and condensed. So the same events and places and people reappear throughout the book, but what might seem to be repetition is in fact difference, because the point is not the large overlaps in what these architects say, but in the small discrepancies. And as a more or less innocent consequence of different opinions and subjective experiences and partial knowledge of events. These discrepancies are analogous to a Japanese garden design technique called miegakure, where as you stroll around the garden, you see the same elements appear, then disappear, then reappear from new angles and against different backgrounds. Less innocently, the stories that are told in this book exemplify what's known as the Rashomon Effect. There's a 1950 film by Akira Kurosawa called Rashomon, in which the same story is told 4 times by the 4 main protagonists, and they each tell the story slightly differently. And none of them is fully truthful. Because in oral history, every narrator is unreliable. Their memories are distorted by time and nostalgia and grudges and wishful thinking. Now, the whole thing took a few years to write, but in a sense, it was underway for decades. It's an outcome of my personal fascination with a particular community of creative individuals and the opportunity to participate at the fringes of that community. Japan's been my home for almost 30 years now, but I'm always going to remain a guest with all of the privileges and restrictions that implies. So in preemptive response to any accusations that I'm appropriating from another culture, I'll only say that Japan itself is exemplary of the way that one culture can be simultaneously an epitome of cultural appropriation from others and of utter originality itself. Now, rather than going into the content of the book, I want to give a kind of epilogue, or perhaps an opening chapter to the next phase of research. I want to trace one of the implicit themes in the book, which is the emergence of an aesthetic sensibility and a tendency in Japan that has a long history, but I think became dominant from about the turn of this millennium. And it's a sensibility that can be labeled cute, or in Japanese, kawaii. So this is perhaps well known in the West, I'm not sure, but it occurs in popular culture, it occurs in, as well in high art and design, in toys and mascots, in fashion, in furniture, in architecture, of course, in houses, in interiors. And now the English word cute derives from the word acute. Cute used to be written with an apostrophe at the beginning, and it meant sharp or shrewd. Then sometime in the 19th century, it gained its current meaning of soft and sweet, which is, of course, the opposite of acute. But cuteness is not beauty. In living things, or in caricatures of living things, at best it's neoteny, which is the retention of juvenile features in the adult, the disproportionately large heads, or wide eyes, or small noses, or short, pudgy limbs. So at best, at worst, it's a kind of a disabling level of deformity, because it's precisely the vulnerability that is attractive and endearing, because helplessness inspires the desire to nurture. So the word kawaii means something close to adorable, but with the nuance of pathetic, that is to say, arousing pity. Now, this sensibility is, of course, heavily influenced by the language of cartoons, which means in Japan, manga and anime, the crisp profiles and the curvy shapes and the vivid colors, and a kind of graphic, flat, two-dimensional expression. We can see premonitions of kawaii in the pre-modern prints of, say, Kuniyoshi, or in the work of Utamaro. But as far as I know, the first Japanese artist whose work was actually called kawaii is the early 20th century painter Takeyama Yumeji, who combined Western and Japanese styles, and he's described as both the modern Utamaro and the Japanese Toulouse-Lautrec. Among other things, he illustrated the stories of a famous female writer called Nobuko Yoshiya, which was serialized in various women's magazines, and were hugely popular with young women in their late teens and early 20s, which is a demographic known as the shoujo. Now, this is literally translated as small woman. It's usually translated as girl, but it means small woman. It implies not quite yet a woman. It specifically refers to the interval between puberty and marriage. And the shoujo started to become a force in Japanese society in the early 20th century as more young women were finding employment in the expanding urban economies, gaining a disposable income and the freedom to use it. So the shoujo included the newly emancipated working woman, but also the flapper-like modern girl, which is known in Japanese by the abbreviation moga. So their image affected fashion and art, such as the woodblock prints of Kiyoshi Kobayakawa, and their economic independence also had an effect on the designs and types of consumer goods. And despite appearing frivolous in terms of self-determination, this was socially groundbreaking and even intimidating, because the moga was seen as attractive and exciting, but also a little immoral and decadent. They were the antithesis of the respectable housewife. And this very visible presence is, I think, the origin of the famously inventive Japanese street fashion, which grew throughout the 20th century and reached its most absurd heights in the economic bubble of the 1980s and 1990s, during which young Japanese women were arguably the most liberated and privileged demographic in the world. And this also influenced a genre of manga in which young women were secretly superheroes or possessed magical powers, exemplified by, say, Sailor Moon. So it's fair to say that kawaii characteristics and preferences in audiences are feminine, which is not precisely the same thing as female, but there are two factors at work. And one is the economic power of young women, which has caused the design of consumer products to skew toward their preferences. And the other is the increasing presence and influence of female architects and designers. Now, I'm aware of all of the legitimate objections to a Caucasian male explaining the desires of Japanese women, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. But the kawaii aesthetic has been both embraced and critiqued by Japanese artists. So, for example, Mariko Mori began her career in the 80s as a fashion model, but then she became a performance artist and turned herself into a manga character, using staged photos or film performances to become an alien or a robot or in some cases, a mermaid, a superhero, or some kind of supernatural entity with a mixture of iconography from science fiction and Buddhism. Takashi Murakami famously uses the techniques and motifs of modern manga, but also reveals their origin in pre-modern screen paintings and woodblock prints, and he sometimes combines the two. And he also hints at an extension into the digital using a deliberately low-res pixelation. Now, Murakami has theorized, or theorized is too strong a word, he's labeled his work superflat. And this describes the visual compression of all of the elements to a single plane, but also the flattening of hierarchy. So low culture and high culture and humor and horror and seriousness and frivolousness all coexist at the same level. And in visual or conceptual terms, we can see an analogous evolution toward flatness in the history of Western art, from the illusory depth of a Renaissance painting in which the picture frame is a window that opens onto another three-dimensional world. Then in Baroque painting, the effect is reversed. The darkened background recedes, and so the main elements appear to project out from the canvas into the real world. And then the compression of the image into the canvas, into the picture plane itself, which is first adumbrated in the post-impressionism of Cezanne, and then reaches an apotheosis in the mid-20th century abstract expressionism and pop art. And you can see an accelerated recapitulation of this history in the evolution of the graphical user interface, exemplified here by the Apple operating system. From System 6 onward, the monitor became an abstract representation of a physical desktop. And as the pixels became smaller to the point of invisibility, and the color gradations became finer to the point of seamlessness, the monitor becomes a window onto a virtual array of icons with increasingly photorealistic depictions of shadow and light and texture and reflection. Then instead of sitting on the desktop, the icons float, they cast shadows, and they project forward into the real world. And suddenly in 2013, there's a radical shift from what's known as skeuomorphic design, which is the representation of realistic objects, to flat design, acknowledging that everything is contained in the zero thickness of the screen. Because as photorealism becomes increasingly easy to achieve, it becomes increasingly unimpressive. So the virtual reality of 3D is replaced with the real virtuality of 2D. And arguably, this is a rise of kawaii culture. It's influenced by market research on consumer preferences. It's also being studied as a technological issue, as a marketing opportunity, and as a sociological phenomenon. Now, kawaii imagery is not always soft and friendly. Murakami, for example, sometimes makes it monstrous, exposing all its latent menace and its implied disease and decay, or sex and violence. by, for example, revealing the libidinous impulses behind Sailor Moon. The artist Yoshitomo Nara does something similar. He gives a kind of sinister quality to drawings of children and animals, reminiscent of picture book illustrations, but also making a link in some of his work with traditional art practices. And then Makoto Aida, who's one of the most important and celebrated artists in Japan right now, takes this kind of work to its most extreme and disturbing conclusions with shocking combinations of beauty and violence. And most of his work I wouldn't show in a situation like this, but a mild example would be the Harikiri schoolgirls, in which uniformed Japanese schoolgirls commit ritual suicide. More overtly feminist would be the work of Miwa Yanagi, who works primarily with staged photos. She became best known for a series titled Elevator Girls, in which she addresses the constraints on appearance and behavior for women in Japan. And then in a later series titled My Grandmothers, she asked young women to describe themselves in old age, then used makeup and prosthetics and Photoshop to create the scenes they described. Now in architecture, the kawaii influence is significant enough for it to have been the topic of a symposium held by the Architecture Institute of Japan and turned into a book. But the clearest theoretical articulation of kawaii architecture is in the work of the architect Tomoharu Makabe. He's written extensively on the topic. The first book he wrote was called The Kawaii Design Paradigm Research. Then there was a 2-volume set called The Kawaii Vision, Part A, Expressions of Sensation, Part B, Techniques of Sensation. And he defines the characteristics of kawaii architecture as incompleteness, irregularity, imbalance, smallness, diversity, likability, and foolishness. But none of these are pejoratives. According to Makabe, up until the 19th century, Japanese houses did not possess domesticity, which he defines as feminine. It was during the 20th century, the concept of domesticity was imported from Western Europe, at the same time as the principles of modernist architecture, which he defines as masculine. And this led to the coexistence of two types of residential architecture in Japan. It was modern domestic, which was feminine, and modern avant-garde, which was masculine. And Makabe asserts, correctly, I think, that in the 21st century, a feminine architectural style, which is not solely the work of female architects, has overtaken the masculine avant-garde. So in order to give some context and adduce evidence for or against this proposition, I decided to try and trace a mini history of Japanese women architects, drawing on much of the content that you'll find in Anatomy of Influence, but also including some of the research that didn't make it into the book and some further research. Now, there are several figures who might qualify as for the title of the first woman Japanese architect. The first candidate would be Nobuko Tsuchiura. She entered the profession almost accidentally. Her husband-to-be, Kaneki Tsuchiura, in 1921, he began working for Frank Lloyd Wright, who was living in Tokyo at the time for the design of the Imperial Hotel. And 2 years later, Kaneki followed Wright back to the US, bringing Nobuko with him. And they worked for Wright for 3 years, first in Los Angeles and then in Taliesin. Nobuko began as the office librarian, but she enrolled in a correspondence course in architectural design and drafting. She became a favorite of Wright. And then when they returned to Japan in 1926, Wright gave her a folio of his drawings inscribed "To Big Little Nobu," which is, in fact, the title of a book that was written about her a while ago. Back in Japan, Nobuko and Kaneki established their own practice. They're most famous for the house they designed for themselves in 1935. But Nobuko became a kind of a media celebrity. She was in popular magazines and newspapers as an expert on home design, and she was kind of a Martha Stewart for pre-war Japan. And she was described as the only woman architect in Japan. Around the same time, in 1937, Miho Hamaguchi entered Tokyo University Architecture Department as an auditing student. Women weren't allowed to officially enroll. She later started her own office, but she was also a theorist. She wrote a book called The Feudalism of Japanese Houses, which was about the way the traditional Japanese house design has a negative effect on the lifestyles of women. And she invented a kind of new functionalist kitchen prototype, which was a combined kitchen and dining room with the intention of allowing families to be together during mealtimes. And this became a standard adopted by the Japan Housing Corporation. And there's an interesting book on the history of the dining kitchen, which describes Hamaguchi as the first woman architect in Japan. Now, it was after World War II, women became permitted to officially enroll in professional architecture degrees at Japanese universities. And Masako Hayashi was a member of the first cohort to graduate. She married a well-known architect, Shoji Hayashi, but he worked for a large corporation, and she had an office under her own name. Most of her work was houses, but she's probably most famous for the Seashell Gallery, which is obviously house-like in its form, but has an interesting skylight effect along the ridge line, which illuminates the central axis. There's a stair, and above which is a glass tray containing seashells. There was a special issue published on her work by SD magazine, Space Design magazine, in 1980. She was very highly regarded as a technical architect. So 2 volumes were published about her detail design. And then the year after she died, there was a major monograph published on her work. She was, in fact, the first woman to win an Architecture Institute of Japan award and the first female director of the institute. Now, the first Japanese woman architect to become a significant figure in the international avant-garde was Etsuko Hasegawa. She came from a very privileged background. She was a champion tennis player. She was a very good oil painter, and she spent her free time sailing yachts. And in fact, she built her own yacht when she was a teenager, and the skills she gained there made her a very good model maker at architecture school, which led to an invitation to work for the metabolist Kiyonori Kikutake. The first thing she did there was build a model for his project for the Kyoto International Convention Center. She worked there for 5 years. She was closely involved in the design of many projects. She suggested, for example, the structural system for the Miyako-no-jo Civic Center, which she described as being like a pram, like a baby stroller. And her influence led Kikutake to change the structural system of the Hagi Civic Center from a heavy concrete structure to a lightweight steel structure based on her knowledge of boat construction. But she was tired of working on large projects. Her passion was actually to design small houses. She was working in Kikutake's office at the same time as Toyo Ito. They both quit about the same time. And Hasegawa went back to study, to do a master's degree under Kazuo Shinohara, the great house designer and the great theorist of houses. And she worked for Shinohara. She studied with him, then she became his assistant throughout the 1970s. But during that time, after hours, she was designing a number of small houses by herself under her own name. And then in 1979, she quit to start her own office. And that year, there was a special issue of SD magazine published on Shinohara, but at the back of the magazine, there's a special feature on what's known as the Shinohara School, 3 young architects who were supposedly disciples of Shinohara. Hasegawa herself, along with Toyo Ito and Kazunari Sakamoto. Interestingly, the essay on Hasegawa, which is in the right-hand page here, the title is Onna de aru koto, which you would translate as something like on being a woman. So her gender was an issue as an architect. One of the first projects she did with her new office was for a client who had a factory that made metal products, and he asked her to use his products in the design of the house. So she asked him if he could make metal panels with small holes punched in them, because perforated metal wasn't commercially available at that time. And he said, sure. So she had about 30 test panels made of different sizes and orientations and shapes of holes, put them out in the sun and observed them over the course of a day and chose the one that appealed the most. And she was trying to recreate her childhood memories of swimming and sailing and watching sunlight sparkling on the ripples in the sea. And so perforated metal became kind of her stylistic signature. She was trying to create soft, ambiguous partitions between inside and outside, but also to evoke natural forms with kind of abstract waves and clouds. The first special issue of SD magazine on Hasegawa herself appeared in '85. Now, up until this point, every single issue of SD magazine had on its cover either a photograph or a drawing of a building, but she put a grid of 35mm slides showing wireframe CAD drawings of her buildings. And this was groundbreaking. It was unprecedented and controversial. She had one of the first offices in Japan to use computers. Now, the magazine contains an interview with Hasegawa with the title Keichiku no Feminism, or the Feminism of Architecture. And the interview is only in Japanese, although the contents page of the magazine is bilingual, and the English title of the interview is A Feminine Touch for Architecture, which is arguably the opposite, has the opposite meaning to the Japanese title. Now, the turning point for Hasegawa and the entire Japanese architecture community, I think, was 1986, which was the beginning of the economic bubble. And there was a special issue of Toshi Jutaku magazine published on the topic of ephemerality, which argued in the editorial that Japan's phenomenal economic growth and the soaring land prices were leading to a new style of architecture, which they called light architecture. And they demonstrated the idea of light architecture by showing the results of the Shonandai Culture Center competition, which had just been announced. And Hasegawa had won first prize. And her work was delicate and light and fragmentary, entirely opposed to some of the other entries, and also the history of public buildings in Japan, which tend to be massive and opaque and monumental and designed by large established offices. So Hasegawa's win changed the aspirations of the younger generation from small houses to bigger public buildings, and also changed the expectations for what a public building might be, and placed her at the vanguard of a new movement of light architecture, which I think has a significant overlap with the kawaii aesthetic. The building was completed in 1990. It made her an international star and also made her a hero to other women architects in Japan. Now, at the moment of the competition, 86, saw the appearance of an architect who was to become one of the most important, or the most important person in the story, which Kazuo Tsujima. She'd spent 7 years as an employee of Toyo Ito, where she was, among other things, she was project architect for Ito's Power for the Tokyo Nomad Girl. We'll sometimes see this project translated as Power for the Tokyo Nomad Woman, but the original Japanese word is shoujo. It's essentially a tent that contains 3 pieces of furniture, a makeup desk, a table to have a cup of tea, and a rack for reading fashion magazines. Tsujima herself is the model in these photos. Now, Pao was a comment by Ito on the speed and vacuousness of life in bubble-era Tokyo, but also a comment on the increasing power of young unmarried women in Japanese society. So Tsujima founded her practice in 87. She began by doing 2 country villas, which she called Platform 1 and Platform 2. There she is at the completion of Platform 1. And both of these buildings have a similarity to the Pao in that they look like architecture that's been assembled from pieces of furniture in a very delicate, insubstantial way. Platform 3 was commissioned but was never built, and at this point she had no work and was on the verge of closing her office completely, permanently. But then she received the commission for the pivotal project in her career, which is the Saishun Kansai Women's Dormitory. It's a dormitory for a large corporation for unmarried female employees. Stylistically, it's very different from the Platform series. It's kind of an abstract rectilinear composition, crisp, flat surfaces, artificial materials, all bleached of color. And rather than generous bedrooms and privacy, she created an enormous shared communal space, and then bordered by 2 narrow strips of bedrooms, and each of the bedrooms had beds for 4 women. And then the ablution areas, the washrooms and so on, were projected out into the main space. Now, the impact of this project was huge. It was featured in the 1995 exhibition at Museum of Modern Art in New York, Light Construction, and was also on the front and back cover of the catalog, and turned her into an international star. Now, the new abstraction and minimalism in the work was partly due to the influence of Rue Nishizawa, who was at the time a staff member and later became a partner in the office they created called Sana, Tsujima and Nishizawa and Associates. And it characterized all the work that followed. So, for example, the 1992 issue of Japan Architect magazine, Emerging Idioms, has Tsujima on the cover, and features her models and drawings that are kind of very kawaii, like toys and cartoons. And they suggested an attempt to eliminate all of the weight and the thickness and the heaviness and the texture of buildings, like architecture as graphic design. And you can see that very obviously in a project like this pachinko parlor, where you have text printed on the glass walls. But even structure, even the structural braces are kind of made to disappear in plain sight, or hidden in plain sight. So the diagonal elements you see here, structural braces, but treated in such a way that they just appear to be elements of kind of the graphic composition. Something similar happens in the Gifu multimedia workshop, where you have this very thin curving roof plate above a basically underground building, which is supported by a row of parallel identical steel flat bars painted white. So from the interior, rather than looking like solid structural elements, it appears to be a kind of a graphic field of parallel lines on the ceiling. Now, conceptually, a very important project was the Kitagata Housing, which was commissioned as part of a social housing development coordinated by Araki Isuzaki, for which he assembled a group of female designers, Sejima Takahashi, Akiko Takahashi, Christine Hawley, and Elizabeth Diller, each of whom did a housing block, and Martha Schwartz did the landscape design. Now, beyond the political gesture of commissioning only women, Isuzaki's intention was to raise the issue of gender and family structure in contemporary Japan. And this relates to a shift in Japanese society in the post-war period arguably from patriarchal to matriarchal, in that Japanese fathers were spending absurdly long hours at work, coming home very late only to sleep. So the role of the head of the family shifted to the mother. Now, it's a very clever, very beautiful composition. You can see that one side has access stairs and corridors, exterior corridors. And the other side should have long horizontal balconies, but instead the balconies penetrate through the block. Each unit, each apartment has effectively an exterior room that penetrates, revealing the thinness of the volume of the building. But the real importance of the building is the way that it subverts domestic living patterns. So the bedrooms, just enclosed boxes without any view or direct sunlight, just places to sleep between working hours. There's no real space for family gatherings. What should be the south-facing living room, the sofa and the television and so on, has become a very thin corridor, fully glazed. And in the middle of that corridor is the wash basin. Behind it is the bathroom and toilet, but the wash basin, it abuts the fully glazed facade. So the most private activities are being put on public display. And by making this the focal point of each unit, Sejima was making a critical statement on the identity of the most important family member, the unmarried teenage daughter who spends all her time checking her makeup and hair in front of the mirror. So the conceptual basis of the Kitagata Housing has its origins in the Saishunkan dormitory project, and even goes back to Toyo Ito's Power project. So the shoujo at this point were becoming known as parasite singles, working but living at home, rent-free, and able to spend their money on fashion and entertainment. That's what those spaces look like in reality once people move in. Now, the influence of the shoujo on Japanese society was first presented to an international audience at the 2000 Venice Architecture Biennale. The Japan Pavilion was curated by Araki Isuzaki with the theme City of Girls. And City of Girls, of course, refers to Tokyo. Sejima and Nishizawa designed the venue. They turned everything white. They repainted the interior. They spread white gravel on the ground, planted white plastic daisies on the slope, wrapped the tree trunks with white cloth. And they displayed work by the fashion designer Kosuke Tsumura, the painter Yayoi Deki, and the Dutch photographer Helen Van Meen, and her photos of young Japanese women. Now, one effect of the cultural and economic power of the shoujo is that international fashion brands do very well in Japan. So Omotesando Avenue, which is Tokyo's Champs-Élysées, is lined with flagship fashion stores. It's a zoo of diverse architectural forms. But the shared characteristic is that they are literally superficial. It's all about the flat surface as both structure and decoration. So here we have Sana's Dior building, which seems to have floating floors, or Ito's Todd's building, in which the overlapping, the crossed lines of the facade are in fact the structure. That's not decoration. There are no other beams and columns inside the building. And something similar happens with his Mikimoto project in Ginza, where the exterior shell with all of these holes is also the structure. There's no secondary structure holding it up. Now, the idea of an articulated, expanded surface for a fashion brand building, I think goes back to Jun Aoki's Louis Vuitton store in Nagoya, where you have a double layer of glass in which you have suspended display cases, and then both layers of glass have imprinted on them a white checkerboard pattern that creates a moire effect as you walk past. Now, Aoki went on to do many projects for Vuitton, but so did a couple of his former staff members. So Kumiko Inui worked for Jun Aoki from '96 until 2000. Then she established her own office and immediately did some projects for Louis Vuitton. You can see here that bricks, white clay bricks, have become a kind of weightless textile. In her Dior project in Ginza, there's a double layer of perforated panels that also creates a moire effect as you walk past. And if you look at the corner of the building, it appears that it's made of pieces of paper. And then her Shin Yatsushiro monument, which is a waiting area at a train station, is perhaps the clearest example of her interest in surface and aperture, in skin acting as structure. Yuko Nageyama also worked for Jun Aoki from 1998 to 2002, then established her own office, also beginning with the Louis Vuitton project, the flagship store in Kyoto, where strips of acrylic create optical effects as you walk past. And she's gone on to do other very interesting projects, such as this apartment building in which the concrete is made to do things you wouldn't expect concrete to do. The building kind of bulges as if it's pot-bellied or pregnant. And then finally, Maki Onishi, who is a graduate of Kyoto University. She works with her husband, and they do extremely kawaii work, I think. Her early career was given a boost by Toyo Ito, who invited her to collaborate on some projects for the reconstruction after the Tohoku earthquake in 2011. Among other things, they collaborated on this children's daycare center. And so I think that the work of Onishi is exemplary of one important tendency in Japanese architecture today, which is the super flat post-digital kawaii. Now, I just want to finish by saying that I don't think any of this work is trivial, or at least that its superficiality might in fact be profound, because cuteness triggers empathy. And if you're in an urban environment that is full of this kind of imagery, it has a neurophysiological effect. I don't want to be too deterministic, but it's possible that the preference for kawaii imagery in Japanese material culture creates a kind of virtuous circle that both reflects and enhances social values of warmth and respect and civility. And so despite the density and intensity of Japanese cities, they're friendly, safe places without all of the tension and hostility and suspicion that's the kind of default setting in harsher urban environments. I'll finish there.
Thank you, Thomas. That's great. That's great to see. That's sort of, in a way, an extension of your book, but actually fairly significant sort of difference in, I mean, obviously, you know, you only had 45 minutes, so you're giving a bit of a kind of overview and a kind of survey. But I mean, one of the things that I think was quite strong in your book was both the sense of the lineage of schools, both in terms of university and study, of who studied who with whom and who had who as a professor, but also people working in people's offices. And so we see some of this, I mean, in a lot of the female architects that you've spoken about in the last 15 or 20 minutes. You've identified where they worked and so on and so forth. But what doesn't seem to come out as strongly, and certainly is there in your book, is this sense of people having to write a manifesto effectively to launch themselves. Whereas, I mean, you know, Hasegawa has the sort of feminism of architecture as a kind of statement, but it doesn't seem to be that same sort of positioning, perhaps with Sejima and maybe the others. I mean, that may just be my non-knowledge of it, but I'm just curious if there's a sort of fundamental shift, and whether that has to do with, you know, and even if in Japan, whether things like books and magazines matter as much. I mean, certainly in Australia, most of the West, we hardly have any architecture magazines of substantial nature. And it's all kind of online conversation. I'm just wondering if there is a shift away from that kind of format and field of expression of establishing a position as well as building.
Yes, I think there's much less writing now than there was. Back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which is really where the period I focused on in the book, architectural journalism was very, very important. And there were many interesting magazines that were not just showing projects, but there were forums for critical debate, and month by month people would reply to each other and present manifestos and respond to those manifestos. And it was a way for younger architects to enter the discourse before they had any buildings. So that, of course, has faded everywhere in the world because of the internet, because of the importance of image culture as opposed to kind of an intellectual writing culture. But certainly many of the architects in the book, Isozaki and Kuma and pretty much all of them, made their early names as writers, as theorists, as much as, more than as designers. Of course, in Japan, there's a hierarchical culture that makes it difficult to be critical of people who are senior to you. So a lot of that early writing they did, they were anonymous or they used pseudonyms. And it was later in their career when they became a little bit more well-established and had more authority that they revealed retrospectively that they had been the author of some of those critical pieces. But there is a sense now that the younger generation doesn't write, and in fact is almost proud of the fact they don't write. We are a generation who don't write, but we present our images and our objects for your delectation.
And do you think that's, I mean, what is behind that conscious decision? Was there a sense that the writing and the perhaps intellectualization wasn't really leading to productive outputs, or that it's not necessary anymore, that they don't need to, and therefore it's kind of anti-hierarchical? That is to say, they don't need to follow those lineages as much. They can just do what they do and get commissions based on previous work.
Well, the usual complaint is that we don't write because no one reads. And we all have this feeling that the younger generation don't read to the extent that the previous generations did. I don't know if that's true. That's probably a perennial complaint. One feature might be the rise of the architecture critic and theorist as an independent figure, because it used to be the case that in Japanese architecture magazines, the text that accompanied the building was written by the architect. Unlike Australia or Western journals, where a critic or a historian will write the text, the architect would explain their own work. But now there is a very strong group of theorists and critics in Japan who are perhaps doing the work that the architects no longer need to do. So when I say the architects don't write, there's still a huge amount of architectural writing, huge amount of architectural publication going on, but it's not by the designers. It's not by the architects themselves necessarily. That's
is that through magazines, or is that more now through books? Because I mean, quote, in the West, Australia, America, Europe, there are more than ever books being published by architects or on architecture or with architectural critics, but there's less and less the magazine culture, which certainly seems strong in Japan, as revealed through your book.
Well, the magazines have been disappearing. So I would say in the last 10 or 15 years, many significant Japanese architecture magazines have stopped publishing. In a couple of cases, they went online and have a much smaller platform, well, broader reach, but less content. So the publication now is primarily books, yes.
I want to go back. I mean, we'll open this up in about 10 minutes or so to the audience. There's already about 7 or 8 questions coming in. It was interesting when you finished on Anishi's work, whose work I don't know, I have to say, but looking at the images and the drawings, there did seem to be a kind of link back to this notion of cuteness, of kawaii. But I'm curious but I would never think of that. Certainly questions of lightness, of thinness come in with Tsujima's work, but I would never think of it as cute in any way. I mean, to me, it has an incredible, both diagrammatic, but incredibly controlled quality to the work of her as well as Sana itself. So I'm curious, in a way you've kind of painted a lineage of cuteness up to the end with Onishi, and within that you have Hasegawa and Tsujima. But I'm curious what you would say is the cuteness of the kawaii of Tsujima, for instance.
Well, of course, these categories that critics and historians try to introduce never fully fit the work being done by the people who actually do the creative work. I would say in Tsujima, certainly a lot of the work is very diagrammatic and abstract. But if you look at, for example, her furniture, it's extremely cute.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. And some of it's interesting. I never noticed this. When we're looking at students' drawings, I suddenly realized there are I don't know if they're Tsujima or they're Sana, but the people, the little black silhouettes of people that populate. All of our students are using those. I mean, they're copying those right out and populating all their drawings with these. And they do have a certain cuteness in terms of that silhouette. That's quite true. Yeah. I want to bring in, there's a question here from Helene Frichot. She says, unfortunately, she missed about the first quarter. So she's just clear to hear more about the aesthetics of cuteness and whether this can be understood as a particularly feminist design approach or not, or is it just a Japanese approach?
Well, that's the kind of question that I would be hesitant about giving any kind of definitive answer to for many reasons. But I think it's just objectively true that a lot of the work is being done by female architects and designers. So that implicitly, I guess, makes it feminine and also feminist at the same time. I think it can be regarded as empowering in a certain sense. And I think that you could very easily make a feminist argument about the importance of this work in terms of identity and presentation.
Mm-hmm. And you're a professor, you're teaching at the university. What are the conversations with students, both male and female, in terms of those questions of identity, those questions of where do they position themselves? Because in a certain way, even these architects that you've shown us now would be considered a previous generation. So I'm curious if that conversation is still current or if that's also shifted.
Well, for example, Maki Oweni, she's a graduate of Kyoto University, and she's also a visiting professor. She's with us quite frequently as a reviewer on juries. She doesn't teach studios, but she's there. And her work certainly inspires many student projects. I think the influence is clear. Whether they articulate it and talk about it in terms of identity and so on, I don't know. But the imagery has a very strong influence on the work being done.
Okay. There's a few questions that have come in, and there's about 3 or 4 that are related to Tsujima's project in Gifu, the housing project. So I'm going to lump these a little bit together. So there's 2 here from Ted Bayu. It says the photo showing how the narrow apartment block with basins to the south is being used appears dramatically contra intention. Is this the reaction or is it a rejection? Where does it lead to his judgment? And aligned with that, he also asked, there's a longstanding Japanese tradition of intensive reverence for heritage architecture. And so, is this still retrained respective the, ceremonies, tea ceremonies and so forth? Where does that fit between the sort of heritage and the sort of new aspects of living, new formulations of living, which seems to be present certainly in the Gifu housing of Tsujima?
Well, the first question, I wasn't quite clear. Was it comparing the image of the space before anyone moved in to what it looked like once people were living there?
I think it's a little bit of both. It's both obviously how they're using it versus how it was intended, but even just the very sort of conception of putting those things in what doesn't seem to be their proper place, I guess.
Right. Well, first of all, that was social housing, subsidized and government supported, which is interesting that they employ avant-garde architects to do it. And it did cause some protests. There was kind of a grassroots protest saying, what are you doing trying to make us live in these strange, unusual, difficult to use apartments? So it was controversial. But there are other people, I'm sure, who love those apartments. So I think that to judge a minimal, low-budget social housing project as representative of wider issues in terms of Japanese culture, I don't think would give a useful answer. But in terms of reverence for history and tradition, I would say it's one of the main characteristics of traditional housing in Japan is that the spaces are flexible. You don't have defined functions for rooms. You don't have a bedroom and a living room and a dining room so much as spaces that can change their function depending on whether you roll out a futon and then it becomes a bedroom, or you bring in a low table for food, then it becomes a dining room, and so on. And then the spaces themselves are separated in a very flexible way with sliding partitions that are open above, so they never can fully seal between two rooms. And this idea of spatial flexibility, of the interpenetration of spaces, I think is absolutely present in a lot of contemporary work. And I had 45 minutes, so there's lots of other things to show. Sure. For example, you could take the Kanazawa Museum by Tsujima, by Sana, which I imagine most people know, which looks like a radically contemporary building, like a circular UFO. At the same time, in terms of its way of creating a buffer zone between interior and exterior, sliding partitions, internal courtyards, and so on. As a diagram, it's utterly traditional, I think.
Oh, it's interesting. I mean, I've visited the Glass Museum in Toledo, and it's absolutely one of my top favorite buildings because it's the only building I've ever been in where it feels, and I mean this in the best possible compliment, it feels like a diagram, that the glass walls are the drawing lines. I mean, the thickness of the glass is equivalent at scale to, a 1 to 100 drawing. So that the line is the wall, as it were. So it's amazing in that kind of diagrammatic embodiment in the best sense of how it all merges together, as well as, when you look at I've seen it in El Croquis, and just following the sequence of iterations. And you mentioned in the book about going to the Sana office, and it's absolutely jam-packed with iterative models, hundreds for every project there are, dozens and dozens of iterations and such. So I think that's an interesting aspect of how the design is generated and how it sort of develops and comes along as well. There's a question here from Laura Martinez, who spent time in Japan. So Laura says, the aesthetics of cuteness in Japan seem to be connected to aspects of the Japanese that embrace a kind of self-deprecating humor or naiveness that somehow is seen as childish or not serious in the West. Would you say there is a certain reluctance to embrace the cute in Western culture? We might be taking semantics here as cute is replaced with other words, especially in architectural circles, as we tend to see ourselves above such childlike attitudes to space, almost as if playfulness isn't important if architecture and architects want to be taken seriously. Is there a kind of sort of very strong difference of how we imagine the world in terms of not being serious means you can't be taken serious, where you could be seriously interested in cuteness, I guess?
Yeah, so I've lived in Japan for a very long time. Perhaps I can't really speak on behalf of what Western people might think and do, but I think it's absolutely true that the final point I tried to make is this kind of cuteness is not trivial and superficial and essentially empty. I think it's actually reflects something fairly profound, and I think it's related to a society that works in an extremely civil, polite, respectful, friendly, and warm way. So I think that the cuteness is not something that people are embarrassed about in the US. It's sorry, in Japan, as they might be in the US or in Europe. I don't know if that's a good answer to the question, but I think yes, it's in a certain sense the humor has a serious quality to it in Japan that's not regarded as trivial.
And would, you know, I mean, given, if we go back to your book, which was really sort of the generation, I mean, you know, you spoke about Hasegawa and you spoke about the women before Hasegawa, but your book kind of ends in a way with Sejima. And then you go into several other more current female architects. How would the generation before Sejima, Shinohara, and you know, even Ito and you know, Isozaki and Hara, how would they see this notion of cuteness? Would they see it as an extension of what they were doing, or would they see it as, again, a kind of break, like, oh, it's not serious, it's not hardcore enough in some way?
Well, I can't speak on behalf of them, but I think you can find elements in terms of kind of a postmodern wit in terms of the use of color and unnecessary forms and unnecessary decoration in the work, certainly of those architects in the 70s and 80s. I mean, I think Hiroshi Hara's work or some of Isuzaki's work is full of elements that would be in sympathy with the kind of work I've been showing today. So, but there's not kind of a consistent position. So in Hasegawa's case, she ran into some problems in terms of the fact of her being a female architect and also having an aesthetic sensibility that was different from other things that were going on. And there was some controversy and arguments and problems. Whereas I asked Sejima about similar issues and she had absolutely nothing to say and no interest in the topic. It was absolutely not an issue for her that she was a woman architect and never caused a problem for her. So I think that perhaps reflects a generational shift. And in terms of I mean, I ended the book with Sejima because everyone in the book is over 60 years old. That was my cutoff point because then their career was clear and I didn't have to, I had enough work to talk about. But the younger generation, there's the very strong representation of female architects doing very well. And I think you can make a case that there's a sensibility among the women architects in Japan that is new and distinctive.
There's a question here from Louise Burchell, who's a philosopher and has ran a course last semester, and she wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more on this sort of question of feminist in the work of the women architects. That is to say, you know, with Hasegawa's The Feminism of Architecture, is it describing a particular attribute to the architecture, and would you say that the position of these architects is a feminist position, or is it actually really more about the feminine?
So, first of all, a kind of an overt feminine quality, I think it can be described as feminist. I mean, it's simply about representation and presence and self-identification. The problem is partly that in Japan, the word feminist, the English word feminist, is used, but in a different way. It actually means something more like what's the right word? It's about being supportive of women and putting them on a pedestal in a kind of a slightly patronizing way, is the way feminism is often used in Japan. So I think that the architects themselves don't necessarily, the female architects themselves don't necessarily want to create a feminist manifesto. That's up to the critics and historians to identify the themes they see there. The question for someone looking at the work is, if you look at the work being done by female architects as opposed to contemporaneous work by the same generation of male architects, can you identify anything different in terms of aesthetic or spatial qualities or material choices and so on? And that's the work that still needs to be done by critics. But as I say, the books I mentioned by Makabe go into this in great detail. He's not solely talking about architecture, he's talking about design and art as well. But he absolutely insists that there's definitely a female aesthetic, that you can call it a feminine aesthetic, but that is inherently also a feminist position.
Okay. There's a question here from Julian Worrell. I'll just read it throughout. It's sort of three parts. It's, do you think that we can somehow associate the rise of cuteness with the rise of the market and the private sector, the emergence of architecture as more of a private consumption goods services than as the agency of state or public purpose that the metabolists, for example, were associated with? Does cute imply a figurative architecture, that is, shapes that personify character in some way? And can we generalize this tendency beyond Japan, perhaps distinguishing between Asia, that is Korea, Taiwan, etc., and Western sphere, Europe and America? So 3 points there. Sorry if I rushed them all through.
Well, the first one about public buildings versus private buildings, I think probably it's true that it's something you could identify much more easily in private houses, but also it's absolutely a feature of retail design. So shops and shop interiors and shop fronts are very often some of the best examples of cute design, as in the many fashion brand stores I showed, and there are many other examples I could have used. So I think it's certainly commercial. So I guess private developers, they're not government projects, but in commercial and retail architecture and in private houses. And the second question was
about it being figurative.
Not necessarily. I think yes, a great deal of it is, or you can see it as figurative in the same way you can see figures in clouds if you have an imagination. But I think it can also be simply geometrical and abstract and colorful and decorative in a way that doesn't need to be figurative in the sense of representing some kind of cartoon character or something anthropomorphic or zoomorphic. And then in terms of the comparison with other situations in Asia or outside Asia, I really don't have an opinion or enough knowledge to say anything on that.
Okay. I wondered, I mean, one of the things that comes across very strongly in your book and was sort of brought up by this question about the sort of economic or the relationship of the economy to particular forms of architectural development, you know, both in terms of opportunities, but also in terms of the sort of image or the aesthetic that might be generated. Your book reinforces almost in every chapter the sort of cycle of Japan's rise as a new economy and the opportunities it provided, and then into the bubble and the incredible opportunities as well as consequence of that stage, and then the period after the bursting, so to speak, of the bubble and where that's gone. And I'm curious if, because, you know, in a lot of other countries, whether it's in America or Europe or even in Australia, these economic cycles have occurred, maybe not to the magnitude that we talk about in Japan, but in some ways, we often see that when there is a sort of recession or a downturn is actually when things start to become actually more interesting, more theoretical, that there's more experimentation in a certain way. So I'm curious, is that, did you see that in the Japanese context, or because there's some sense that in the bubble period, actually, that's when an incredible amount of experimentation was going on because anything was possible to be built at the same time.
Yes, so during the bubble period, for better or worse, a lot of frivolous, indulgent buildings were built, but it really pushed forward our discipline in terms of the experiments that were enabled, and the Japanese construction industry developed ideas that are still in use today in terms of structure and materials and so forth. So the bubble period really was a tremendously fertile period for architecture. But what followed the bubble, the recession of the 1990s, is the generation that saw the rise of people like Atelier Bow Wow, who began their careers with writing and research because they had no work, and a much more kind of considered, careful, intellectual understanding of the environment rather than simply building spectacular objects. So the bubble created incredible creativity in terms of design. The post-bubble period, the 1990s, saw a period of much more intellectual work and much more humble architecture, but equally inventive in its own way.
There's another question here from Helen. She's saying, you know, it's interesting that the dormitories at Kitagawa, I mean, the project by Sejima with the dormitories, and then to a certain degree with Kitagawa, the dormitories and the social housing designed by Sejima in plan appear to be quite brutal in terms of access to privacy and the capacity for family life. Are there negative critiques of these plans too, in terms of what might be called social engineering and the impact on family social relationships?
Well, the dormitory was for unmarried women, and the lack of privacy is deliberate because it's almost military in the sense of creating a sense of unified community. Everyone's in the same situation. Everybody has to participate and contribute and interact with each other. So that's deliberate. It's not just that building. That's the way these kind of company dormitories work in Japan. And then in terms of the social housing project, as I say, there were some complaints about that building by residents, but Sejima's position was that to make a living room with a couple of sofas and a television and a place where the family gathers and chats and or shares their evening meal is not realistic, because that doesn't happen. That's not a feature of contemporary domestic life. And her project was intended as a diagram, a slightly cynical diagram of the reality of the way families interact now. So it's a theoretical and critical project that was controversial.
And would you say that in that sense, it's I wouldn't call it reaction, but a kind of embodiment of the given, as opposed to a promotion of a new alternative? I mean, you know, there's a kind of, you know, if we look at some of the modernism was suggesting that there were new alternatives to living and social relationships. So it was a kind of projective project. Would you say that with Sejima that the social housing is just to say, well, this is the way it is, so we're designing to what actually is, not about what we would project into a kind of future condition of social relationships?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think that probably it's not a projective, optimistic project so much as a realistic, almost slightly pessimistic project about the state of family life.
There's a question here from Devin, was wanting to see if you could expand a little bit on the idea of the super flat and how this aesthetic and theory relates to architecture. This question of the super flat as a trajectory.
Well, I hope that was somewhat clear. So, and as a kind of a physical visual.
Well, I mean, I think it was clear in terms of a kind of laying out what is there. But I'm curious what I'm expanding on this question. I don't know if this is what the questioner asked, but I guess it's what. There's one thing to do it because you can, or it's different than what's been done. It's another to take it as a kind of ideological position that super flat is in response to ideas. I remember I'm trying to think who it was. Maybe it was, I can't remember if it was Sejima or if it was Kuma, was talking about not doing concrete, so to speak, not doing the kind of tradition that concrete was there as solidity. It was about thinning things out and such. So I wonder, is this an extension of, I think it was Kuma that was relating that. Is this notion of super flat part of that trajectory?
Well, Kuma talks about escaping the clutches of concrete. He hates the concrete boxes of Tadao Ando and architects like that. He wants to make his buildings porous. But he's doing something different. He's really interested in the materials and the textures and the substance of the building. He's a materialist in that sense. And the super flat is more, I think, a kind of an abstraction as a kind of a physical material project. It's an abstraction about absolute thinness and delicacy. And you can see that in the work of Ito and Sejima and so forth, in terms of making the building almost appear to have no structure at all. It is magically two-dimensional as possible. But that's the visual effect of the super flat. The theory behind it is the idea that there's no hierarchy. There's no high culture or low culture. There's no seriousness, or seriousness and humorousness are not separate fields. So the idea of combining all of these elements into the same place, or putting them on the same level, I think is also manifest in the building. So let's say the kind of the imagery that you might associate with the cuteness, the kawaii aesthetic of humorous colors and shapes, will also now appear in buildings that also have serious purposes and also achieve those purposes with much more substantial architectural construction. So yes, I think that the kind of the pop culture references and the serious architectural tectonics all combine into the same project in a way that you could also argue is theoretically super flat.
And do you think, I mean, it's interesting because my first exposure to Sejima was, and I don't remember where it's at, but a tea house, which is really just a thin roof and some columns. And what I admired about it was, well, what I read in the magazine or wherever I saw it, was there was this attempt to try to make the roof as thin as possible. And one of the ways to do that was just to have a lot more columns than an engineer would suggest. And so by having so many columns, the roof could get incredibly thin. But then those columns also deployed the space in a way which is very different than a structural grid would deploy a space. And so I'm wondering if certainly with Sejima and with Sana, that notion of thinness or even super flat is also a kind of, not anti, but a sort of not seeing engineering as necessary, that you can achieve things without having to be bound by kind of not trying to do something fantastic from an engineering point of view, but actually doing something so simple by breaking the notion that to be efficient, you have to have a column grid, that actually you just put more sticks up to hold up a very thin roof.
Yes, but of course, to achieve those effects requires incredibly sophisticated engineering. And the work of Sejima and Ito and Suzaki relies on, in most cases, a guy called Mutsuro Sasaki, who is able to calculate the effects necessary to make it appear that the structure is almost absent. So not only do the elements become thin because you need more to support the weight, then you have the issues of torsion and bending and so on. So in fact, the image of non-engineering is a consequence of hugely complex engineering. It's like magical illusions that require an awful lot of behind-the-scenes work. So when you have a situation where, as you say, if the columns become thin, you need more of them, and then because they don't have the torsional strength, you need even more of them. What happens is they become so thin and so many of them that they no longer look like structure. They look like part of the kind of composition of dots and lines.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm interested then in that sense, where is that, I'm interested in that relationship between the architect and the engineer. I mean, are these seen as quite close, but almost invisible relationships? I mean, I know, in the book, I think it was when you were talking about Ito and his work with Cecil Bauman, there was some sort of input and aspects that came into it. And increasingly, for a lot of architects in, quote, the West, their acknowledgement of how important that face-to-face and developing relationship might be. So I'm curious, like, for instance, with Sana, are those ideas developed in-house, or is there a kind of secret team of engineers that nobody knows about that are doing this incredible work to make it look like it's purely an architectural idea and it's also an engineering idea?
Oh, they're absolutely close relationships with the engineers. And the name I mentioned a minute ago, Mutsuro Sasaki, he is the top experimental engineer in Japan. He's Japan's Cecil Bauman, and he works very, very intensively with the leading architects of Japan, and his presence is not a secret. There are books published about his work. He's a very famous person, and that relationship often happens at the beginning. There are projects, Ito's Serpentine Pavilion, he has said basically it's not really my design, it's the engineer's design to achieve what I achieved there. Ito, in fact, will often say, I have no idea how to design, how to build what I design. I just know that the Japanese structural engineers in the construction industry will find a solution for me. So the engineer is hugely important for these experimental projects, and the relationship happens very early on in the design process. The Sendai Mediatek, for example, the first thing Ito did was fax his first sketch to the engineer and said, can we do this?
Great. We've got just a few more minutes. There's Louise Burchell has come back because I didn't quite accurately elaborate her question, but what she says what she'd still like to know and to understand about what is the argument in Hasegawa's text, The Feminism of Architecture. I mean, what's the kind of core argument that she's making in that text?
It's not a text, it's not an essay, it's an interview.
Mm-hmm.
So the interviewer asks her a number of questions about her experience as a female architect, and in fact, in Anatomy of Influence, she brings up many of the points she raised in that interview are also in the interview I did, where she talks about her early intimidation, early part of her career, that architecture was seen as a practical, rational profession, and she was sure to fail because her approach was much more intuitive and romantic, let's say. I mean, I know these are terrible cliches that are sexist in themselves, but that's the way she described it. She was saying she had to, first of all, gain the confidence that her way of thinking was different from her male peers, but also valid. And she also mentions the fact that a critic called Koji Taki, who in fact was the interviewer, wrote an essay, one of the first essays ever written about her work was on the topic of simplicity and diversity, the way through simple forms she could achieve very diverse effects. And she said that essay, reading that essay about her work, was what actually guided her in the work that followed. But the Feminism in Architecture is not an essay by Hasegawa, it's an interview with Hasegawa. It's an
interview, okay, great. I mean, it was one of the things that I mean, it's a kind of almost an anecdote, but when you were introducing Sejima in your book, and the interview that you had with her, and you're asking about where she started, where did she get interested in architecture, and she talked about growing up near a very important building that she was interested in, and then she started making structures and houses and various things and drawing. She was, her parents were going to build a new house, and so she started drawing floor plans and everything. And then there's a point where her mother said, well, you know, you left out the staircase. And, it reminds me that Flaubert has this book called oh gosh, I've forgotten the name again, the Dictionary of Received Ideas. And in the Dictionary of Received Ideas, the definition of an architect is the one who forgot the staircases. And so it was very interesting that this sort of anecdote of her life as actually starting at the age of 5 of already imagining herself as an architect and starting to draw floor plans for her family is the kind of quintessential Flaubertian definition of an architect, those who leave out the staircases. So listen, I think we'll probably end it there. I've got one more question here I'll try to get to. It's actually 2 questions, so I'll kind of link them together. This is from Nancy, and she's asking, are there any examples of the kawaii concept beyond the graphic super flat aesthetic, that is, through materiality, especially in reference to the red school of architecture as opposed to the white school? She says, I'm thinking in particular reference to Fujimori Toranobu, for example, who has produced work that is also considered kawaii and Studio Ghibli like, but achieved in different ways to the examples that you've shown.
Well, it seems she answered her own question. The work of Fujimori, I think, is absolutely related to the cute, figurative, humorous, witty work that you find in graphics. It's not simply a graphic design issue. I talked about superflat and painting and graphic design, but of course it relates to mascots and consumer products and three-dimensional objects made of physical materials. But Fujimori is an excellent example of the way that translates into architecture, and of course he's one of the key figures in what's known as the Red School of Japanese architecture.
Okay. All right, well, listen, we might leave it there. And really, really thank you. There's been, there's been some great questions, but almost every one of them is prefaced by saying how wonderful your presentation was and how great it was to be able to listen to it and to hear and see the work and your analysis. So I want to thank you very much for being with us, for being part of this MSD at Home series, but really for bringing us some incredibly insightful and thinking about the context of Japanese architecture and the architects, but also pushing it to the next iteration and to the next volume of this research and development that you've produced. So thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you for being with us. I just make a couple of announcements to say that with MSD at Home, next week at this time at 12 o'clock on Wednesday, we have Winka Duppeldam, who'll be coming to us from New York or Philadelphia with her talk on strange objects. And then on the same day, in the later part of the afternoon or early evening, we have Darinka Kozeski, who will be talking about housing and particularly some of the social transformation work that's going on in terms of different alternatives to housing. So again, thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you for those who have tuned in, and we look forward to our next meeting up. Thank you, and goodbye to everybody.